So my name is Leonard Olsen. I come from Lund University in Sweden, I will have a short introduction, so setting the scene for a perennial revolution. So the first question is, what is a perennial revolution? As I see it, it's an idea. It's an idea that agriculture needs to move much more closely to the functioning of natural ecosystems, because natural ecosystems are the only ecosystems that are truly sustainable. And the most salient feature of natural ecosystem is that they are dominated by perennial plants. Annual plants are quite rare, actually, in natural ecosystems, and it's only our agriculture that made annual plants so abundant in the world, and also created much of the problems that we know of from agriculture. So in a kind of nutshell, the perennial revolution is an idea that we should have agricultural systems that are dominated by perennials. This sounds like a simple thing, but actually, until recently, there were no perennial grains that we could use. Almost all the agricultural crops, they are annuals. Something like between 80 and 90% of the acreage that we harvest is actually annual plants. But as Rachel said, thanks to plant breeding and research, there are now a number of perennial grains that are being almost commercial or becoming semi-commercial. So we can say that we have shown proof of concept that is possible to domesticate plants that are perennial. And Tim Cruz will talk more about different approaches to this later. Another salient feature of natural ecosystem is that they are diverse, and they're diverse in space. In agriculture, we have realized that diversity is important, but we usually have diversity in time. So crop rotations, for example, but we need diversity in space. So intercropping of various kinds. We would like to see a natural nitrogen fixing process to dominate. At the moment, agriculture is so dependent on synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. It's actually consuming or responsible for about 3% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, just the sheer manufacture of nitrogen fertilizers. Nature can do it, and that's a kind of agricultural system we need to move towards. We need to have a symbiosis with soil biota. In the last 20 years or so, we have seen a kind of paradigm shift in soil science from understanding soil as mainly a physical or chemical system that can be modeled using chemistry and physics. But this paradigm shift has shown that it is actually an ecosystem, a biological system. So biology is the driver of soils. And we need to pay much more attention to soil biota than we do in conventional agriculture. And we need to have much more of a farmer and rural community-centered approach to agriculture. At the moment, agriculture, the dominant forces, political, economic forces, are not farmer and rural community-centered. They are more commercially oriented. So that's, in a nutshell, is some of the most salient features of what we think is a perennial revolution. So it's not just to change to perennial crops, but a kind of change of mindset. Just in a nutshell, what are the biggest problems associated with annual monoculture that covers something like close to 90% of the agricultural acreage we have? Soil erosion. Soil erosion is still a very, very persistent problem in all conventional agriculture. 2 to 3 magnitude soil erosion is 2 to 3 magnitude orders of magnitude faster in conventional tilled fields than in natural ecosystems. Nutrients. We apply so much nutrients, and most of it actually, or at least half of it, of the nitrogen is lost. And the loss of nitrogen and phosphorus to some extent is a main reason why we have polluting, we have the growth of dead zones in coastal regions. Almost every major estuary in the world has one of these dead zones outside its estuary. Carbon, we are losing carbon from the soil, carbon that goes up to the atmosphere and where it contributes to climate change. We need to reverse that and have agriculture that is a carbon sink rather than a carbon source. Weeds is a major problem, and we use chemicals, enormous amounts of chemicals for fighting these weeds. And that is the main reason why we have such a problem with loss of biodiversity. We have the pollinator crisis and so forth. And we are consuming a lot of energy. Many conventional agricultural systems are actually, you need to put in as much energy, even more energy than you can harvest. Of course, we would like an agricultural system that is harvesting more energy than we put into it. Socially, agriculture as we know it is characterized by what we call the agricultural treadmill, a kind of treadmill where farmers are trapped into increasing the efficiency at the cost of sustainability, but also the rural livelihoods are, farmers are extremely indebted, they are extremely stressed, and the profitability is very low, to a large extent because of the use of annual crops that needs to be replaced, resown every year. And with it goes a lot of land management, tillage, and other labor-intensive and capital machinery-intensive practices. And if we come to the who is in charge, here is a graph showing the number of unique resistant cases, sort of plants, sort of weeds that have become resistant to herbicides. And we can see this tremendous increase from the 1970s, that it's a kind of game that we can never win. But of course, if your business is to manage a problem, you really don't want this problem to go away. That is why a perennial revolution is such a radical shift in thinking, because it's the vision of agriculture where we don't need herbicides, or at least a minimum of herbicide, instead of adding more and more and more herbicides as we do currently. So to sum up, is the perennial revolution desirable? Yes, of course. And as I see it, it would be the first agricultural revolution that would bring farming closer to ecological functioning of natural ecosystems. So the previous revolutions after Neolithic revolution some 10,000 years ago, we had the moldboard plow, for example, in the 19th century. That was a major step in agriculture, but it was also a major step in making agriculture more destructive. We had the Haber-Bosch revolution, by which we could add synthetic nitrogen to the fields. That was a major step in making agriculture more efficient, but at the expense of many environmental qualities and also the release of greenhouse gases. We had the GM, genetic transgenic revolution, you can say, of the 1970s, 80s. There was another kind of revolutionary change that again distanced agriculture from its natural ecological functioning. So as we see it, this would be the first time a major agricultural revolution would bring agriculture closer to the functioning of natural ecosystems, and thereby truly sustainable in a long-term sense. If we look ahead, some 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years. So towards the end of this century, climate change will render many of our conventional crops unfit. They will be sensitive to heat stress, drought stress, and so forth. The older cultivars are probably not going to, it's not going to adapt them to these conditions. We've simply lost too much of the genetic diversity to do that. So this is an opportunity to actually create an agriculture for posterity, an agriculture that can function in the climatic conditions that we expect to have in 4, 5, 6, 7 centuries, decades into the future. And to sum up, I think I used to explain this as a farmer's dream, but the agricultural input industry's nightmare, because we will need much, much less of agrochemicals, synthetic fertilizers, and machinery. So from a farmer's point of view, I think this is where we have to go. And with this short 10-minute introduction, I would like to hand over the word to Tim Kruse from the Land Institute, who will talk much more about the different approaches we can use for creating those perennial grain crops that are necessary for making a perennial revolution possible. So I will stop this sharing and I hand over to Tim Kruse.
All right, thank you, Lennart. Well, greetings everyone from the Land Institute. As Lennart just concluded, there are very many compelling reasons why diverse perennial grain agroecosystems would go a long way to address numerous pervasive and critical ecological and social challenges that stem from the annual grain agriculture that feeds us today. Many people throughout history have relied on food sources that were fundamentally perennial. Indigenous peoples of the Great Plains of North America, where Kansas is today, lived on buffalo and harvested many perennial plant species of the native prairie. These food systems were remarkably sustainable, both ecologically and socially. Yet, as happened with so many well-adapted indigenous food systems, the bison were largely extinguished with the arrival of European settlers and eventually replaced by annual cereals, which today supply most of humanity's calories. In the course of human history, only annual plants were successfully selected on or changed through domestication processes to become the high-yielding cereal, pulse, and oilseed crops that feed us today. And in some ways, only annuals could have been selected on, because in order to turn a wild plant, like this Helianthus annuus progenitor of sunflower, into a sunflower crop, the plants had to die every year, have their genes reshuffled through cross-pollination, and be sown again. Perennials do not die every year, which greatly limited the potential for the type of selection that made our current grains in the first place. Now we are in a better position to reinvent agriculture to resemble other major ecosystems that exist in nature, by starting with species like, in this case, Silphium integrifolium, a deep-rooted perennial species. Work on breeding perennial grains, and in particular perennial wheat, began in the 1920s and 30s in the former Soviet Union. And additional work was carried out in Canada, the US, and Germany between 1930 and 1970. Rye was another cereal that received a fair amount of attention in the Soviet Union and Germany in the 20th century. While none of these early efforts resulted in robust perennial crops, progress was made, and some of these early lines are still included in modern perennial breeding programs. The 1980s marked a decade of new players entering the field of perennial grains, including the Land Institute, the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania, US. And then in the 1990s, others joined, including Washington State University, the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, CSIRO in Australia. And since then, research on perennial grain agriculture, including breeding, agronomy, ecology, and social sciences, among other disciplines, has exploded, as illustrated by this recent but already outdated map of Land Institute research partners. The rapid expansion of interest in perennial grains that has occurred over the last 2 decades can in part be explained by a growing recognition amongst researchers and to some extent the public at large that perennial species are remarkably efficient at taking up water and nutrients, building soil carbon, suppressing weeds, and other functions that Lennart described. But another attraction is that plant breeders have a toolkit now that simply did not exist before. And this gives them an advantage over the perennial breeders of the 20th century. Until recently, plant breeders relied almost exclusively on plant phenotypes to inform their breeding strategies. A phenotype is simply the outward appearance of a plant, and it is influenced by the plant's genes and the environment in which it's grown. Crop phenotypes are still very important, but now breeders also use molecular tools to look right into the DNA of plants that make up breeding populations to see if they have gene sequences that code for specific desirable or undesirable traits. And if the genome, meaning all of the DNA of a crop, is adequately characterized, it is possible to build a statistical model of many genetic markers, allowing breeders to analyze leaf tissue samples of seedlings and broadly predict how well a unique genetic individual will perform over multiple years with respect to numerous important traits like seed size or disease resistance. This is called genomic selection. These techniques are not genetic engineering, as they're tools simply providing the breeder with information about the crop's DNA to supplement the traditional phenomic information that breeders use to make decisions about cross-pollinations and selections. While these molecular tools are not essential to breed perennial grain crops, they have the potential to accelerate progress, which, depending on the specific crop and social circumstances of the breeding project, may be advantageous. Plant breeders at the Land Institute and partner research institutions and organizations around the world are taking two generalized approaches to developing new perennial grain crops. The first, illustrated in the left panel by intermediate wheatgrass that produces the grain kernza, is de novo domestication, in which breeders carry out repeated cycles of selection on wild perennial plants to improve on important crop traits, such as not dispersing seed, also called non-shattering, or evenness of seed maturation. This process of domestication is how our current annual crops were developed from wild species. The second approach is wide hybridization, in which an elite annual crop, in this figure, we're using rice or Rhiza sativa, is crossed with a wild perennial relative, Rhiza longistaminata, in order to introduce genes coding for perennialism into the annual. Wide hybridization can in a way be thought of as perennializing an annual crop. Now, there are pluses and minuses to both of these approaches. Thus far, domestication projects have involved plant species that are robust, typically deep-rooted perennials that are well programmed to alternate between vegetative and reproductive stages for numerous years. In contrast, a somewhat predictable challenge of crossing different species through wide hybridization commonly results in genetic compatibility issues that can compromise perenniality. As we will hear, there are examples of these challenges being solved. But in general, addressing these genetic compatibility issues comprises a significant percentage of breeders' bandwidth. Breeders working on domestication projects are more focused on classic domestication traits, such as increasing seed number and size and non-shattering. Yield and seed quality in wide hybrid crosses, on the other hand, tends to be good, as these characteristics can be inherited from the annual parent. Finally, progress in domestication efforts tends to be slow but predictable, whereas progress through wide hybridization can be rapid but is less predictable. This slide identifies 4 perennial crop breeding efforts: wheat, rice, sorghum, and barley, that are currently under development through wide hybridization between an elite annual crop and perennial relative. We will hear more about each of these crops by presenters later in the program. At the Land Institute, breeders are working on these 3 perennial grain de novo domestication projects. Silphium integrifolium, also called sillflower, is a member of the sunflower family native to the Midwest US and being bred as an oilseed crop. Sainfoin is a forage legume being bred as a dual-use forage pulse crop, pulse being a legume grain. And intermediate wheatgrass is a forage grass that is being bred as a cereal under the name kernza. Intermediate wheatgrass is also a dual-use forage grain crop. Anna Westerberg will discuss kernza in a few minutes, but I wanted to highlight a few features of these other two species. Silphium flowers are very cooperative with plant breeders because the number of seeds in a head corresponds to the number of flower petals. This makes it easy to select for yield. But it was drought tolerance, or more precisely drought avoidance, that turned our attention to Silphium as a potential crop. During the droughts of 2011 and 12 on the Great Plains in the US, when annual crops across Kansas were suffering and even dying, Silphium seemed to not even notice the lack of rain. And Silphium does indeed have a very deep taproot, as well as fine superficial roots that grow laterally. We believe this plant could perform well under more erratic precipitation regimes that result from climate change. Moreover, it has great potential to tap water and nutrients from below the topsoil. Sainfoin is another crop undergoing early domestication for grain. It originated in Eurasia and has already been selected as a forage legume. Now it is being selected for seed yield and other attributes, which, if successful, will result in crop that produces both forage and grain. It provides for its own nitrogen through biological nitrogen fixation, tolerates drought. And both Silphium and Sainfoin provide excellent nectar sources for pollinators. Sainfoin and Silphium represent two domestication projects in which key plant traits of wild plant species are targeted in the breeding process to make them desirable food crops. Each of these crops, as well as others we are going to hear about, have hubs of researchers at multiple institutions working in coordinated efforts to accelerate progress in bringing these new perennial crops to fruition. But if we are going to have the diversity of crops needed to capture the ecological functions that crop diversity has the potential to deliver, we need to expand the diversity of perennial crops under development, which means we need additional research hubs. Whether a new team is interested in making perennial hybrids between annual crops and wild relatives, or domesticating wild perennial species to become food crops, researchers at St. Louis University and the Missouri Botanical Garden have synthesized listings of herbaceous perennial members of the species-rich grass and legume families, as well as a large branch of the perennial members of the species-rich, as a resource, species-rich, I'm sorry, let's see, let me start again. Have synthesized listings of herbaceous perennial members of the species-rich grass and legume families, as well as a large branch of the sunflower family as a resource for groups selecting new perennial crop candidates. The global inventory, as it is nicknamed, can be found on the Tropicos website that is hosted by the Missouri Botanical Garden. At the Land Institute, our goal is not to develop perennial grains and simply substitute them for annual grains on the landscape. Substitution would deliver some improvements, but as Lennart pointed out, farms of the future will need to do a lot more with a lot less. If we are going to improve on the health of our soils and ecosystems in general, while using less fossil fuels, having less predictable weather, less nitrogen and phosphorus and pesticide inputs, we will need to design agroecosystems that maximize ecological intensification. That is, using ecological processes to replace the need for purchased inputs. This is a tall order and will require a full court press pursuing ecological intensification at multiple scales, from breeding disease resistance into crops at the population or species level, to configuring diversity in crop communities that can deter the spread of pest insects and diseases, to reducing soil disturbance and creating root biomass and diversity at the ecosystem scale in order to sequester carbon, retain nutrients, and actually build soil itself. to landscape level changes that have the potential to impact and improve on local to regional hydrology and other large-scale ecospheric processes. It's an exciting time to be involved in literally developing new routes for agriculture. But this excitement is nested in an existential urgency as we work to make agriculture ready for the climate, energy, and food supply challenges that lie ahead. Fortunately, there are some amazing people working to make it happen. And you will now get to hear from a few of them, starting with the Land Institute's own Fiona Nabukalu, a perennial sorghum breeder who is based at the University of Georgia campus in Tipton, Georgia. I'll now turn it over to Fiona. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
While Fiona shares her screen, I just want to offer that we do see there are a couple hands raised in the audience. We ask that you please submit your questions into the Q&A function on the webinar, as we will not be doing live Q&A for this session.
It's a great pleasure to talk to you today about the development of perennial grain sorghum. My name is Fiona Nabukalu, and I'm a perennial sorghum breeder at the Lund Institute. So sorghum may be less well known to people in America as a staple food and most of the other developed countries. In most of these developed countries, sorghum is used for feeding poultry and livestock, and humans consume it indirectly through consumption of poultry and livestock products. But elsewhere in other parts of the world, sorghum is consumed directly as a staple food, and in some parts of Africa, sorghum may be accounting about 30% of people's diets. Sorghum is also considered as one of the most drought resilient crops among the major grain crops, and it requires about 1/3 the amount of water that's required to grow wheat and about half the amount of water that's required to grow corn. Sorghum also performs relatively well in marginal soils. So development of perennial grain sorghum or sorghums that produce multiple crop harvests from a single planting will address a wide array of issues, including climate change and food security. So here at the Lund Institute, we are developing perennial grain sorghum, and it's developed through interspecific hybridization between sorghum bicolor, which is the cultivated sorghum, and sorghum halepense. So on the right, we have sorghum bicolor, which is the cultivated sorghum, and it's popularly known as Milo in USA. And on the left, we have a sorghum halepense, commonly known as Johnson grass, and it's a wild perennial relative of sorghum. So our goal is to transfer genes that confer rhizome development and perenniality from sorghum halepense into sorghum bicolor. So the main means by which sorghum, which happens to be a tropical crop, can be perennial, survive winters, and grow back each and every spring under temperate and subtropical environments is through the formation of these underground stems called rhizomes. So rhizomes basically just enable the plant to go through harsh environmental conditions by becoming dormant. And whenever conditions turn better, these rhizomes just develop into new above ground shoots. So what we've noticed is that the depth of the rhizomes is very important in ensuring the survival of these perennial sorghum plants. Rhizomes that are normally formed at the soil surface have high chance of being damaged by adverse weather conditions. Here is just a close look at the mature heads of sorghum bicolor, which is the cultivated sorghum, and sorghum halepense. So this is clearly to show you that the main genes that we are interested in tapping from sorghum halepense are mainly genes for perenniality and rhizome development, but we would wish to maintain all the other good traits from cultivated sorghum or sorghum bicolor. So this is what normally happens under temperate environments, say in Kansas, in the early months of spring. If you walk through a perennial sorghum field around maybe late April or early May, you'll find that there are new shoots that are coming up from the old field. These plants are emerging from rhizomes. And from our experience with perennial sorghum, these plants will emerge about 4 weeks before farmers are able to start sowing a new sorghum seed. Furthermore, regrowth from these established plants will flower in the first 1 to 1.5 months after hard winter kill. So it ends up giving a farmer a head start. So overall, we would want to have enough rhizomes to overwinter, but not for the plants to take over. So developing perennial sorghum is a little bit tricky, mainly because these two species of sorghum have different chromosome numbers. So naturally, sorghum bicolor or the cultivated sorghum has 20 chromosomes, while sorghum halepense is a tetraploid that has 40 chromosomes. So you forming a cross between two species with different chromosome numbers is always a challenge, but through various technical procedures, we've been successful at creating viable hybrids from crossing these two species. So the hybrids that we get tend to, always have a combination of traits from the two species. So we start off with crossing the two species, we generate the F1 hybrids, then we grow out the hybrids to generate large segregating populations. So it's from the segregating populations that we select the best perennial plants that we cross back to sorghum bicolor. So it's always a cyclic process, generate the best perennials and cross them to sorghum bicolor. And we do that in order to regain most of the good traits from sorghum bicolor, but make sure that we retain our trait of interest, which is perenniality. So some of the plants that we obtain and our breeding target is to come up with plants that look more like sorghum bicolor or the cultivated sorghum, but we want these plants to have the new trait of perenniality. And from this plant, we can easily tell that this plant is going to be perennial, but it's not much different from the cultivated grain sorghum. So we are developing this crop in a way that farmers can grow and harvest it in a conventional way, harvest it with conventional equipment, say use of a standard combine. And we are working towards improving this crop seed size, flowering time, disease resistance, and so many other traits. Most of the plants that we get have a moderate in seed size. So we've made significant progress in increasing of seed size. So some of the early perennials that we started with had a seed size close to that of sorghum halepense. So sorghum halepense, which is the perennial relative, has very tiny seed. On average, it has about 3.5 milligrams per seed. So you can compare that to the inbred lines that we use in developing perennial grain sorghum. So the inbred lines are in their 20s, while commercial hybrid sorghum is usually in the 30s. But most of our perennial lines are in the higher teens, and we hope to make significant progress in that or have the seed size beyond that. So here I'll show you some results on grain yield. This was a trial that was established in 2011, and we were comparing the best breeding lines that we had generated in our first 8 years of establishing a perennial sorghum program here at the Lund Institute. So in this trial, we had 30 lines, of which we included the perennial, the wild perennial sorghum halepense. So that was our parental source of perenniality. Then we also included the 2002 lines. So these were so seed was harvested from the best perennial plants that we had identified in 2002, and these were coming from a very wild population that we started with, and this germplasm was obtained between the 1980s and the 1990s. So that's the batch of seed that we started with for the program. And then we had the 2006 lines. So these were lines that were generated from crossing the 2002 lines and crossed them back to sorghum bicolor or grain sorghum. Then we had the 2009 lines. So these were the best perennial lines that we had identified by crossing the 2006 lines back to grain sorghum. But as you can see from this chart, from this graph, there was there's a trend of increase in grain yield. So say the 2002 lines we started with had the grain yield averaged about 1/3 the amount of grain that we had obtained from the commercial hybrid sorghum. And then the 2006 lines averaged about 2/3 of the grain yield that we obtained from the commercial hybrid sorghum that we used. And then the 2009 lines averaged about 3/4 of the grain yield that was obtained from the commercial grain sorghum. So I forgot to mention that we also included a commercial grain sorghum hybrid that's normally used by farmers in Kansas. So this was the one in green, and we compared all these lines to the commercial hybrid sorghum. So despite making this remarkable progress in developing perennial grain sorghum, we still face some challenges. So some of the plants that we observe or obtain still show some wild parenthood characteristics. Some of these plants tend to have traits that are generally undesirable in a crop plant. So we are trying to we are trying to select against all these traits. Oftentimes, you'll find that some of these plants have excessive plant height, excessive tillering and branching, which we are not interested in, or even the farmers are not happy about. Some of these plants have thinner stems. They produce many more stems with smaller heads, but we are trying to select against all these bad traits, and we hope to make good progress in that. So some of the plants that we work with turn out to be winter hardy, and another selection turns out to be non-winter hardy. So the germplasm that we are using to developing perennial sorghum for the temperate zones is what we identify in spring to be winter hardy. But then we also get this germplasm that's rhizomatous but non-winter hardy. So this is the germplasm that we are using to develop perennial sorghum for the tropics and subtropical environments. So we are collaborating with scientists in African countries. We are collaborating with scientists at ICRISAT, Makerere University, Kenya, scientists in Ethiopia and South Africa. So we are testing the adaptation and perenniality of these perennial sorghum germplasms under tropical and subtropical environments. And the goal is for these scientists to cross this perennial sorghum germplasm with their locally adapted annual sorghum lines to come up with perennial sorghum that's adapted to their local environments. So I would summarize my talk by saying, as we confront global climate change, we expect the population to increase to about 10 billion people by 2050. We are already observing declining ecosystems and changing soils. Development of drought-resilient perennial grain crops promises to be an important solution for feeding the world in a more sustainable manner. So grow perennial crops and grow them differently. Thank you. So I'll hand over to Fenyi from Yunnan University. What's going on?
Sheila, you might need to unmute.
Okay. Thank you, Fiona. I'm Shilai Zhang. I'm from Yunnan University. I will give a speech instead of Professor Fengyi Hu. And my topic is perennial rice, where it may go. And in Yunnan, 94% area was upland, and most of people in mountain area, the upland rice was the main stay food for the mountain area farmers. But we know after the harvest the upland rice, it will cause the soil erosion after winter. And the second issue was heavy work for rice production, especially in mountain area. The work was labor consuming and phosphor consuming. So in 1989, IRRI raised a new idea, breeding perennial upland rice, using the rhizome from the wild species. So our strategy was to select a strong rhizome wild species named Oryza longistaminata, which was the same AA genome with the same AA genome similar to Oryza sativa. So here is this is the longistaminata from West Africa. And this is the strategy. We cross the longistaminata with sativa and hope to select to perennial rice. We made the first. We made the original cross from since 1997. And then we back crossing and self crossing. Finally, we select some perennial rice breeding lines. And in the first round, we select 4 lines, which are PR 23, 24, and 25, and 1 indica 101. And in the second round, the molecular assistant selection was used, which PR 107 was selected. And PR 23 was the first released PR variety in 2018. And here is the granularity. Here we can see the old stems still. And we can, and the new tillers comes from the underground rhizome parts. And here I will show the case of PR23 for large-scale use in Mengzhe site from 2016 to 2019, which regrows 4 years and 7 seasons. So this is the first season. And this is the stage after first harvest. And here is the second season. This is the after the second harvest over winter. This is the second year, the third season. the fourth season, the fifth, and the sixth, seventh. And what's the benefits after using perennial rice? As we know, we can cut the the rice production into 6 steps for annual rice. But for the perennial rice, since the second season, we can reduce the 1 to 4 steps, which the cost of the 1 to 4 steps was 0. So finally, after 4 years using 7,500 yuan per hectare per season was saved, and 75 labels per hectare per season was saved. And this is the ecologic benefits from the annual to perennial rice. For the annual rice, which we need to prepare the field every season. For the perennial, since the second season is no tillage, which can reduce soil erosion, enhance soil property, improve soil nutrients, increase soil biodiversity. And also, here we can, it shows that since the first season, AR here, to the fourth year, the TOC and the STN was increased, and we estimate that one half of the rice area was planting. If one half of the rice area planting the perennial rice, it will reduce 131 million tons of soil carbon erosion and 17.8 million tons soil nitrogen erosion. So this is a transformation from annual to perennial. It's for sustainable agriculture. Even the perennial rice have too many opportunities or too many benefits. It still have some challenges, such as the perenniality, genetics, and the drought tolerance, hot tolerance, and the cold tolerance. So far, the perennial rice was used in 9 countries all over the world, including China, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and African rice, and Uganda. So where the perennial rice go? It will go to start from Yunnan to South China, and then to Southeast Asia, to India, to Africa, to South Africa. So here is some reference of the perennial rice. And our work was supported by many units. Thank you. Next speaker is Anna Westerberger from Swedish University Agricultural Science. Thank you.
So thank you. And hello everyone. I'm Anna Westerberg, researcher at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences in Uppsala, north of Stockholm. And I'm a biologist and plant geneticist. And my main interest is the breeding of new crops for sustainable agriculture and increased food security. I will talk about the ongoing development of perennial grain crops for temperate climates. Within the temperate zones, the climate varies from cold and wet to hot and dry, and this affects the type of crop that we can cultivate, and therefore also needs to be considered in the development and breeding of new crops. Agriculture is facing many challenges. It should produce food even under stress, under increased temperature or wetter or drying conditions. And at the same time, agriculture systems, especially with annual crops, they have a negative impact on the climate and environment, as Tim and others described in more detail. So the agriculture is both affected by and is affecting the climate. But by cultivating crops with perennial and better traits, the negative impact can be reduced. During cultivation of annual crops, there are a number of different activities and inputs that are needed every year by the farmers, causing negative impact on the soil and on the environment that you just heard about. However, the many different traits of perennial crop plants give several advantages for the environment and the climate. They use the whole growing season, cover soil, and reduce nutrient losses. And they give a sustainable agriculture for several reasons and with increased biodiversity. The large root systems bind carbon, reduce loss of greenhouse gases, and improve soil health. And higher stress resilience increases food security. In temperate regions, perennial grasses and legumes such as timothy and clover have been cultivated by farmers for fodder and grazing for several centuries. And crops that are annual, such as barley, wheat, peas, and beans, are also used as fodder crops. And annual grain crops are also cultivated only for their seeds, for starch, protein, and oil. However, for the change to a perennial agriculture, the perennial grain crops for human consumption is the missing piece of the puzzle. But work by us and other breeders are ongoing. Perennial grains in 3 crops or groups of crops are under development for cultivation in different temperate climate regions and are advancing rapidly. The breeding of the different crops was initiated at different times, and the crops are at different stages of development. And in the group of oilseed crops, Tim described the work on silflower, silphium, and in the group of legumes, to work on sainfoin at the Lund Institute. I will focus on the perennial cereal grain crops. And the first attempt to develop perennial wheat was by crossing annual wheat cultivars with perennial wheat relatives. And a number of different hybrids have been developed by the Lund Institute and other institutes. And the Department of Primary Industries in Australia is very active in the evaluation of wheat hybrids. The development of the perennial wild relative of wheat, intermediate wheatgrass, is more advanced, and the breeding has been carried out at the Lund Institute for about 20 years. And during the last years, in collaboration with the University of Minnesota, USDA, and the University of Manitoba in Canada. In 2018, my research group and I at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences initiated a breeding program on intermediate wheatgrass for Sweden and cold temperate regions. And we have also initiated a breeding program towards perennial barley, evaluating two different approaches, one based on the domestication of a perennial wild relative of barley, and the other based on barley hybrids between barley cultivars and a perennial wild relative. Annual wheat, barley, and maize are the most important staple crops in temperate climates and grown in large areas. And if these annual grain crops could be replaced by perennial cereals, at least in some of these areas to start with, this would make a huge contribution towards sustainable agriculture. For the development of perennial wheat and barley, the wild perennial relatives to our annual wheat and barley crops are the starting material for the breeding. For perennial barley, it's the genetically closest perennial species, Hordeum bulbosum, and for perennial wheat, it's Tinopurum intermedium, the Latin name for intermediate wheatgrass. And they carry important traits for perennial growth, and they're also adapted to different growing environments and have a high genetic diversity, characteristics that are all important for selection and breeding of new resilient crops. So let's look into the work on intermediate wheatgrass. Using the domestication breeding approach, the wild intermediate wheatgrass has been changed so it is cultivatable and carry favorable traits. And this is done through repeated selections and crossing of plants with the best traits, which also Tim talked about, and cultivars with different traits can be developed. So in other words, we are domesticating the plant in similar way as our ancestors did 10,000 years ago, but we can do it much faster with modern breeding methods. Resistance to seed shattering and traits increasing the yield and thresherability are examples of traits that are under selection. And as a result of a number of selections, two early cultivars of intermediate wheatgrass have recently been developed. And the trade market name for the grain of intermediate wheatgrass is Kernza, and it's owned by the Lund Institute. And many different products are developed based on Kernza grain. The advantage of this domestication approach is that we can use the high diversity in the original wild population, carrying all the necessary traits, which makes a plant perennial. But the challenge is to increase the harvest and to adapt it to the growing conditions where the crop will be cultivated. Intermediate wheatgrass is the most advanced perennial crop for temperate climates, and the lead scientist of the breeding is Dr. Lee DeHand at Lund Institute. And the breeding was initiated 2003 with material from the Rolday Research Center in Pennsylvania and has now reached selection cycle 10. Through domestication and breeding, a number of traits have greatly improved. For example, the yield has increased with more than 200% during the first 8 selection cycles. And results from North America currently show 20 to 25% of wheat yields from the same area. Additional breeding programs have been initiated at the University of Minnesota and the University of Manitoba, and lately at the USDA in Utah and the Swedish University in Uppsala. A collected effort by different research groups in the US and Canada have made breeding progress possible, and different genomic resources have been developed. And one important method is genomic selection, which also Tim talked about. And the calculation models are developed based on the understanding of which genotype, based on a number of markers, give the best trait, for example, the largest seeds. And when these models are developed, the plants with the best traits can be selected based on only their genotypes, without growing the plants in the field and studying the traits for several years. And this results in more specific selection of the best genotypes and large improvements of traits during a short time. Continuous breeding together with developed management will result in higher yields, and intermediate wheatgrass can preferably be grown in polycultures with nitrogen-fixing legumes such as alfalfa. Intermediate wheatgrass originates from Southern Europe and Asia and was successfully introduced to the US and Canada in the early 90s and improved for cultivation as forage grass. And introducing intermediate wheatgrass as a forage crop also in Europe and other temperate regions may be an important first step for a later successful introduction of intermediate wheatgrass as a grain crop in these regions. Meanwhile, the breeding is continuously improving the crop. The breeding of intermediate wheatgrass in North America has been very successful, and it goes from Kansas further north to Minnesota and Utah to Manitoba in Canada. However, in order to cultivate intermediate wheatgrass in regions with other climates, it has to be adapted and selected for cultivation to seasonal changes in these areas. And like other areas in northern cold temperate climates, we are in Sweden facing distinct seasonal changes. There is variation in temperature and precipitation during the 4 seasons, and an even more distinct variation in day length over the year. And plants use day length as an important environmental signal to decide when to grow or adapt for freezing temperatures. And perennial plants have therefore to tolerate frost in the spring and fall, low temperatures in the winter, and flower and reach maturity during short growing season with long days. In 2018, we initiated a breeding program on intermediate wheatgrass for cultivation in Sweden and Northern Europe. And like other programs, it involves evaluation of a large number of individual plants. And we have made the first selection, the best plants, for further evaluation and crossing. And the next step will be to include genomic selection. For developing perennial barley, we are using the wild perennial Hordeum bulbosum as the genetic resource, and we initiated a domestication program in 2017 based on a large diversity of plants from Southern Europe to Asia. And the first selection of plants was done this summer. Before the domestication program was initiated, we evaluated 17 wild perennial species related to annual barley. And the species with the best survival and regrowth was Hordeum bulbosum, and therefore selected as the candidate species for perennial barley. One idea to make perennial serious is to cross high-yielding wheat and barley cultivars with perennial relatives with the hope to make use of advances made for annual cereals. And this is the wide hybridization approach, which we also have heard about when Fiona described sorghum, for example. Several different sources of wheat and perennial relative have been crossed, and here bread wheat has been crossed with intermediate wheatgrass. And when the hybrid is further crossed with annual wheat, often a whole chromosome of the perennial parent is transferred into the genome of the cultivar. However, the extra chromosome is often lost in later offspring generations. Barley cultivars have been crossed with the perennial Sorghum bulbosum, and chromosomal segments of the perennial plant is integrated into the barley genome. However, crossing over events when perennial chromosomal segments are transferred are rare, and so far, less advanced perennial wheat and barley crops have been achieved using this wide hybridization approach, in contrast to the success in rice and sorghum. Wheat and barley and their relatives belong to a different group of cereals than rice and sorghum, and hybridization events are more rare in the wheat and barley group. Well, to learn more, we have evaluated a number of barley hybrids for perennial growth in Sweden. And also recently, 35 wheat hybrids were evaluated on 4 continents, and variation in performance was found. New promising perennial wheat lines developed at the Lund Institute are also under review. I will end by showing an example of how cereal grain crops can be important for food security under stress and drought. And in conclusion, with the knowledge and technologies we have now for plant breeding and crop development, we are in a good position to develop high-yielding perennial cereal grain crops. I would like to thank researchers in my group, the funding agencies, and the support from the international perennial community, and you for listening. The next presenters are Aubrey Strick-Krug from the Lund Institute and Omar Pestel from Birzeit University.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being with us today. I'm Aubrey Strick-Krug, and I'm honored to have the opportunity to deliver a collaborative presentation with Omar Pestel, who will be sharing about his work. Building upon the presentations our colleagues have just shared about new perennial grain crop development, here we wish to explore how perennial grain agriculture may emerge. What research and methods, in addition to plant breeding and ecology, are needed, and what do people do? So I'll turn it over to Omar.
Thank you, Aubrey. It's a pleasure to be with everyone here. If we can move to the first slide, thank you. We are presenting today based on an article that we published last year called "A Social Perennial Vision: A Transdisciplinary Inquiry for the Future of Diverse Perennial Grain Agriculture." And what we argue in this article, which actually emerged from a presentation at Lund University in 2019, is that the enterprise of domestication and the enterprise of agriculture is an inherently social enterprise. And that is an enterprise that is both evolved in the production of food, but also in the research needed to produce the crops. And so in this article, we try to lay this out. In these photographs, we have photographs of the visit of Lund Institute researchers to our research sites in Palestine in 2018 and 2019. On the right-hand side, we are visiting a local expert with wild food plants, and on the left-hand side, with local breeders at a plot to evaluate wild perennial barley in Palestine. Move to the next slide. One of the most engaging things about what we're doing in Palestine is that it is the site of the earliest domestication. One of the sites. For millions of years, it was under the sea and under ancient oceans, until geologic processes emerged and the Africa plate collided with the European plate. The shift to a Mediterranean climate happened only 3 million years ago in Palestine, which is very recent, in which a scrub forest emerged and what is now known as the Mediterranean climate emerged. Humans emerged from Africa to this area in Palestine about 100,000 years ago. And only 10 to 12,000 years ago did the domestication of wheat, barley, lentil, pea, flax, and other crops from this amazing supermarket of plants that grow in the wild until today. In the photograph that you see here, in this very site, I have seen wild perennial barley, wild lentil, wild chickpea, wild wheat, simply growing among the olive trees. This agricultural system supported people for 10 to 12,000 years and continues to support them in Palestine. And that production system traveled the world. It is now around the world, for better or for worse. And these plants, which are wild plants native to Palestine, now dominate agricultural spaces across the world. Our research site, our research group emerged from this context 6 years ago, right about the same time, just before meeting researchers at the Land Institute for the first time. It is informally known as Makaniyat, which translates into spaces. And this is a gesture to our interest in the landscape as our scale of intervention. So with support from Birzeit University, the Land Institute, and the Palestinian American Research Center, we work to show and implement the social perennial vision of an agricultural landscape through community-based research and education and scientific research. So we try to hold these two together. And here we like to think that we're working in teams of both people and plants. The plants are very much part of our team. And I think the presentations, the previous presentations also show this, so that we can reach a more equitable and just arrangement across this landscape. And here it is very much related to the points made earlier, that it is not only across time, but across space that we're interested in this more equitable and just arrangement, just as an intercrop may be a more just and equitable arrangement. So at once we're broad and specific, but the landscape scale is what we're ultimately interested in the regeneration of food and human communities in these diverse perennial practices. I work with my colleagues, a team of about 6 people in Palestine, on a variety of methods. We had to lay the groundwork from the beginning, basically, to document and inventory the plants that are available to us, using all kinds of methods, including geodata and GIS methods to field research, collections. We have an open source data platform. We conduct interviews with elders. We publish scientific peer-reviewed journal articles. We publish guides in Arabic and in English. We use archival photography, and now we are conducting very early field trials of candidate species so that we can work within the landscape that we have, which is dominated now by a woody perennial crop, to introduce a perennial grain, our perennial grain crops into this woody crop, which is the olive tree, an amazingly perennial plant. And I'll just pass on to my colleague Aubrey here by saying that on the left-hand side of this photograph is an olive grove that is dominated by a wild population of wild perennial barley growing by itself. So I think if we are able to increase the yields in collaboration with researchers around the world, the yield seed size, we already have the polyculture there in the photograph.
Thank you, Omar. So in our analysis, we recognize how the development of annual plow-based grain agriculture has provided the infrastructure for our current global human society. And in a social perennial vision, we're interested in exploring how perennial diverse grain agriculture can provide a new infrastructure for the development of new human societies. But while an agriculture that provides food along with these ecosystem processes may make more just and fair human systems possible, it doesn't guarantee them. So perennial grains inspire this new vision for human communities in which humans live and eat more ecologically and fairly. But to accomplish this vision won't be inevitable. It will require a lot of work in the near term in order to make such a long-term vision possible. We hypothesize that just as our agricultural systems need to change biophysically, they also need to change socially and culturally. And we hypothesize that human learning and cultural change is necessary and has been necessary to spark and scale and sustain the scientific research that's needed to realize these diverse perennial grain crops and cropping systems. And the development of those crops and cropping systems may in turn, we hope, feed more equitable and just human communities. More just and caring and knowledgeable communities that accept limits may thus be our best hope to sustain ourselves in the near term and bring these perennial grains that hold soil and work with ecosystems into production. And of course, since people are not only part of agriculture, but feeding people is the point of agriculture, our motivation for social and humanistic research and transdisciplinary research to help develop sustainable agriculture is to ensure the longevity of these human communities. So how do we move in this direction? Everyone has a part to play, and from our place as a plant science-based research institution, I want to share briefly 4 developing areas of research at the Land Institute. So the first, which I'll just touch on briefly, is highlighted here at the top right, and it's about building and sharing foundational knowledge about the ecospheric context for human species and for agriculture. So this is our ecosphere studies branch of research at the Land Institute. The ecosphere is the dynamic mantle of life on this planet within which we humans evolved and are embedded. And ecosphere studies is an effort to build and share knowledge about this context for us, including the ecological and energetic limits of this context. So we encourage humans to do the relational work of learning in order to build these more knowledgeable human communities with humility and also with a great sense of urgency. Second, we can integrate cultural change and social learning with new perennial grain crop domestication. So as you've heard, domestication involves changes to wild plants. Domestication also involves changes to people as we create new mutualistic relationships with these plant species. Successful food crops are the ones that are widely planted and tended and eaten and valued by human communities. And at the Land Institute, we are working on a method called civic science for which we can build human relationships with these future grain crops. Our civic science projects gather data across multiple locations for use in plant breeding and ecology, and they broaden and sustain public participation and learning. So we collaborate with people around the US who grow perennial grain crops like Silphium and Sainfoin in their backyards, farms, and community gardens. They observe and collect data and photos across a wide range of environments, and they're also learning through their hands-on interactions, the materials we provide, and their work with our scientists. And we're learning too as researchers and collaborators. Through the stories and experiences civic scientists share, we're investigating how to sustain motivation for people, diverse groups of participants and researchers, as we relate to each other and to these plants for multiple seasons perennially. Oops. Third, the Land Institute's crop stewardship program works with partners and farmers to create innovative, sustainable supply chains that help people and economies steward and value perennial grains from farm to plate. Grains are certainly valued based on flavor, calories, yield. In addition, we envision them being valued for their ecological and social benefits. And to work toward that vision, crop stewardship creates and disseminates knowledge about crop production and valuation, builds collaborative networks with supply chain stakeholders, and engages partners to create polycentric systems for governance of crop resources based on stewardship models. Finally, as we've heard about in the presentations today, there are research hubs that are developing perennial grains and cropping systems around the world. Now we look toward growing the number of hubs, the kinds of perennial grain crops they're working on, the variety of places and people engaged, and the pace of this research, so that we can continue to grow towards a perennial future through research as well as learning and advocacy. New Roots International is the Land Institute's initiative to grow the infrastructure for a global movement that links localized hubs. We envision perennial grain crops that are ecologically adapted, culturally valued, and economically viable at local and regional scales, and that nourish good human communities in an enduring ecosphere. Low input perennial grain agriculture could help communities as they learn to persist through crisis and remake their local and regional food systems to achieve perennial food security within ecological limits. So that is our social perennial vision. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to discussing more about how a more diverse and just and perennial grain agriculture may emerge.
Okay, so we have now come to the section of question and answers or discussion, but actually there isn't much time for this. So when you have fun, time flies. But we have two very sort of broad and extremely important questions that we will try to cover briefly. And then there are a couple of more clarification questions that we will respond to through emails. So the first one goes to Tim. And it's a question about weeds. How can perennial systems, do they generally suppress weeds, or do they tolerate more weed pressure than annual crops? So can you say something about how perennial systems can reduce the need for chemical or mechanical weed management?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And it's important to recognize that weeds move into landscapes when there's available resources of sunlight, nutrients, or water that are not being used by the vegetation that is already there. And so you can imagine that perennial systems do have challenges with weeds in the establishment phase. Perennials are out the gate a little bit slower than annuals. And so it can be an issue to get a perennial crop established. And there's a lot of folks working on the agronomy of how to do that with nurse crops and other techniques to suppress weeds while the perennials are getting established. But once established, and these crops are emerging already established at the beginning of growing seasons, there tends to be a much less problem, a much reduced problem with weeds in at least well-established perennial cropping arrangements. It's complicated on a cropping system by cropping system basis, but simply speaking, you should have, and we do have, far less weed pressure in well-established perennial crops.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from a perennial colleague of us, Richard Hayes in Australia, and it's a question that I will direct to Anna. are there reasons to believe that wide hybridization would be more or less successful in barley than in wheat? And or are the prospects equally good with barley and wheat? Please, Anna.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, for this interesting question. The challenge during the wide hybridization approach is, like I mentioned, to develop both for perennial barley and for perennial wheat is that the problem with crossing over events. And this is, it takes place during meiosis, when pollen and also egg cells are formed. And these crossing events are rare, both when you're crossing wheat with the perennial wild relative and also barley with a perennial wild relative. But if this is successful after thousands of crossing events and a number of an analysis of different seeds, and you happen to see a plant that has been developed through, or it is actually a hybrid, and you have segments integrated to this plant, then those hybrids are much more stable in barley because they are integrated into the genome, while often in perennial wheat, you have an extra chromosome that are often lost after some generations. When you cross perennial barley, when you cross wheat with the perennial wild relative, you can get more of the perennial wheat genome into the hybrid. But like I said, it's not preserved over generations. So I would say that there is an advantage actually for the perennial hybrids, barley hybrids, compared to the perennial wheat hybrids.
Okay, thank you, Anna. And we are now exactly on 4:30 at least in the place of the earth where I am, which means that we are supposed to wrap up. But I can tell you that we will put our presentations on available to everybody here. I hope that is correct, Rachel. We can put them on the Land Institute homepage, so you can find them if you like. And if you have questions, then don't hesitate to contact any of us about them, and we can continue the discussion. So I suppose that's the end for today, and I hand over to Rachel for a final word. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for joining. This has been inspiring. I do this work every day, and I'm still inspired when I see all these people on the same screen talking about the important work that's happening all over the world. Special thanks to our colleagues in China, where I believe it is 11:30 at night. You can go to bed now. I appreciate your attention. Thank you all, and we'll be together again soon.